George Russell wins in Singapore. Where did this pace come from for Mercedes this weekend, and how did they put together this race win? Max Verstappen takes home P2, but he was probably coming out of Sunday hoping for a little more, especially after qualifying on Saturday. What does this result mean for Max's championship hopes and Red Bull's outlook for the rest of the season? And McLaren clinches the Constructors' title. But we're talking about a few other things with McLaren as Oscar and Lando have another on-track incident at the beginning of the race. We have a lot to talk about coming out of the Singapore Grand Prix, and it's all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. Mercedes is back on the top step of the podium. George Russell takes home P1, Max Verstappen P2, Lando Norris P3, Oscar Piastri P4, and Kimi Antonelli finishes P5. It was a great weekend for Mercedes, but a perfect weekend from George Russell. Of course, he set himself up for this Sunday with his qualifying result on Saturday. Incredible qualifying lap, especially his final run in Q3. But put himself on pole and is exactly where you want to be at this racetrack, where track position is just so important for the outcome of the race. Of course, a lot of this did come down to the start of the race, though. George had an incredible start off the line, at least a much better start than Max did, and that's all he needed to do, was get ahead of Max going into the first few turns, come out ahead, and it was his race to control. And that's exactly what he did. Pretty uneventful race for George for most of it. Ends up taking home the victory, the sixth different winner in the last 6 races here. But again, just a perfect Sunday from George, where there was some action happening on track, but it was much farther behind George. There were a few moments at the end where Max was catching up, but a lot of that I think came down to George just trying to get through traffic and overtake the back markers and, just kind of work his way through that. He did get helped out a little bit by Max's strategy. Of course, Max started on the soft tires. George started on the mediums along with a handful of other drivers and most drivers in this race. I think that was probably a mistake by Red Bull to do that, because if Red Bull put Max on the mediums, put him on the same tire strategy as George, I think it could be a different race. And maybe at least Max puts some pressure on George, is able to keep up with him during that first stint, and maybe even the possibility of an undercut during the pit stops too. But Max starting on the softs really allowed George to pull away and build, I think it was an 8 or 9 second gap during that first stint. But again, Max came back at the end, was dealing with some issues with his car too, but just couldn't get close enough. And even if he did, I think once George got past Max on the first turn at the start of the race on lap 1, it's just so hard to follow cars around here. It's so hard to pass them on track. And we saw a lot of that today. So even if Max was close, I think George would have had enough to really hold him off and take home this race win. But it was a lot easier than that for George. Really kind of cruised to victory during this one. We didn't see a lot of him on the broadcast, but a very good weekend for George and a very promising weekend, especially for his contract negotiations with Mercedes. Again, still not a contract signed for 2026. We expect something's going to happen very soon. We know George Russell is going to be on Mercedes for 2026. It's just a matter of, will this be a 1-year deal? Will it be a 2-year deal? There were some rumors that came out during the race weekend that George had signed a 1+1 deal. Basically, a second year would activate if he outperformed Kimi Antonelli by a certain percentage of points. That's been denied by George, been denied by Mercedes. We'll see what really comes out. Again, sometimes you hear these rumors and, they deny them at first, but then as time goes on, they admit, okay, yeah, there is truth to it, and we get an official announcement. So we'll keep an eye on that. But exactly what George needed, a race win and a dominant race win to really help him with those contract negotiations. This one will mean a lot for the Constructors' title and those standings. Not really the title for Mercedes, but as far as their positioning with P2 in the Constructors' standings. But very good win in that aspect, but probably a more important win for George's future with the team. Will this be the last win for Mercedes this year, though? I don't think so. Looking at the calendar, we've got 6 races left to go. I like them in Vegas. I like them probably in Brazil too. Of course, Vegas was where George won last year. He has won in Brazil before in 2022, his first win actually of his F1 career. Vegas, same conditions, same track layout, same setup that we see in this race. So if they were strong here, there's a good chance they'll be strong in Vegas too. Of course, we'll probably get cooler temperatures in Vegas than we had here in Singapore. And that was another thing with Mercedes this weekend was the hot temperatures are usually pretty detrimental to their car. And we didn't see that this weekend. A very strong result. And we not only saw it with George, but we saw it with Kimi as well. He finishes P5 after qualifying P4. A little bit of a disappointing start for Kimi. Dropped 2 spots at the start. But P5 is probably where he would have ended up anyways throughout the race. I think the 2 McLarens, which we'll get to in a second, were just a lot faster than him. And even if Kimi was able to hold them off, well, of course, Oscar started ahead of Kimi. But even if Kimi was able to hold Lando off at the start and keep him behind, I don't think it would have been long before Lando got around Kimi. Whether it be an on-track overtake, as hard as it was here, I think McLaren still would have had the speed to make that happen, or an undercut with pit strategy. One of those probably would have happened, and we would have seen Kimi fall back to P5 anyway. So, probably a little bit of a disappointment for the start, something he can learn from. But again, I don't think it was really detrimental to his ultimate race result. This is probably where he would have ended up anyway. But P5 finish, very good for Kimi, especially at his first race at this track, dealing with these conditions, the heat, the humidity, the exhaustion, the tight, walls around the corner or around the track. Really impressive to see Kimi come home with this result. And I think the team should be pretty impressed by it too. Kimi, during those summer months, really struggled during the European races. We were seeing results that just were out of the ordinary for him, especially from what we saw from him to start the season. So for him to have another positive result coming after Monza, coming after Baku, where it looks like he really started to turn things around, definitely what he wanted and definitely what the team wanted for him. So hopefully he can build onto this the rest of the season and into 2026. But a really good day for Mercedes, taking home the win, a good result for their second driver, and some ground gained in the constructor standings, which is going to be very important as we head to these final 6 races. Going to Red Bull, Max Verstappen finishes P2 after qualifying P2. A good result for him, and a promising result for Red Bull too, because this was a track where we wondered, are they going to be as strong as they look like in Monza, in Baku? And they look pretty strong this weekend. A little bit of disappointment for Max, though, because I know he was coming out of this Sunday. You could see it on his face. You saw him make comments about it on Saturday after qualifying. He felt like he could have won this race. And it really came down to qualifying on Saturday. Of course, there was the incident with the final run on Q3 where Lando had either abandoned his lap or he had completed his lap and was coming into the pits, but he's just ahead of Max. Max is on his flying lap, coming around the final turn, coming up to it. Lando dives in the pits, and because of that, Max has to back off, abandon his final lap. That slots him into P2. I would have to look back. I think he was close to George. I don't know if he would have had enough, even if he kept pushing, to beat George's time in Q3, because that was an incredible time by George on his final run. But Max was very upset about this because the way it works with the track is with Lando diving into the pits there, Max couldn't take that final turn going flat out just because of the dangers there. I don't know if there's a rule behind that or if that's just driver etiquette, but it would have been a very close and probably scary situation for him to fly by Lando in the pits, going at that speed. So probably the right call for Max to make. But was it a dirty move by Lando, like Max thought it was? I don't think so. I think it was just unfortunate timing. There was some talk afterwards looking at Lando's on board about, how fast he downshifted coming into the pits and kind of setting himself up to get in Max's way. I don't know. And the stewards looked at it too. They disagreed, didn't think it was anything that warranted a penalty. Sometimes we see this with Max, where he takes things a little too personally. He thinks people are out to get him. Again, it was unfortunate. It definitely hurt his final run, but as far as it being a dirty move by Lando, I just don't think that was the case. But Max came out of that situation very upset, saying, I'm going to remember this one, and it's not going to be forgotten as far as what Lando did to him. We might have seen a little bit for that on Sunday, with Max kind of just holding up Lando and keeping him in the dirty air. Whether that was intentional or not, that's something left to be said. But Max felt he should have gotten pole coming out of Saturday. And it hurts even more at a track like this because if you get pole, if you take the lead, you're in control of this race. And it's a very easy race to win if you can manage it successfully. Similar to Monaco, not as bad as what we see in Monaco, but still, pole qualifying position, very important. But Saturday wasn't the only thing that worked against Max. He had a terrible start to this race. Not so bad that he fell down the order. He still held on to P2, but it was clear right at the start watching this on TV. George got away very quickly, and Max, I don't know if he just didn't get the revs up. It didn't look like there was any wheel spin. It looks like he just messed up the start a little bit, and George got a better start. And I think there was some pit strategy errors on the Red Bull side of things too. Starting Max on soft tires, I touched on it with George, but I get why they would make the decision going into the start of the race, especially with how important it is to get ahead thinking, all right, if we put Max on softs, George is on mediums, Max should have enough to get ahead of George, get him, on the inside line and into turn one and ultimately take the lead and control the race. It didn't work out that way. And I don't know if the start came down to tires or if it was something more on Max's side of things, but more so after the fact. If they're both on mediums, if George still gets ahead, I think Max is probably able to stay up or keep up with George a lot better than he did during that first stint because you saw the soft tires with Max fall off pretty quickly. And he knew there was no real threat behind him with Lando. Of course, Lando was close, but he knew, all right, if I manage this the right way, I can keep Lando behind even if he has a much faster car. But I think he really would have gone a long way with keeping up with George, putting some pressure on him. And also, too, when the pit stops come, maybe there's an opportunity for an undercut, for Max to come in early, get ahead of George, and then the rest is easy for him to manage as he takes it home for a race win. But that's not what Red Bull chose to do. They chose to go with the soft tires, and I feel like it probably would have been better to start on the mediums, and especially looking at Max's second stint too, when both vehicles or both cars were on hard tires. Max was faster. He was catching up to George pretty quickly, and again, there were some back markers that George was, trying to get around at that point too, but Max had to get around him also, and he was really starting to close the gap. He was dealing with some issues though, and that would have been another factor if he was able to take the lead. How does that all play out? Because there were some downshift issues that have been plaguing this team for almost 2 years now. Some other sort of issues that Max was dealing with that he vocalized on the radio but didn't really specify what what exactly was going on. But then at the end of the race too, really struggled a lot with braking. Had a couple moments where he almost went straight into the wall. I don't know how he saved that. There was another one where he went off track too. So definitely some issues for Max to manage throughout this race. And he did a good job managing those issues because there was some pressure at the end from Lando. Some pressure at the beginning too with Lando during that first stint. But Max knew what he needed to do to hold Lando off and to hold on to that P2 position. So good result for Red Bull. But was it enough for Max and his championship hopes? Yeah, he finished ahead of Lando. Yeah, he finished ahead of Oscar. But he needed more. If Oscar's finishing P4, if Lando's finishing P3, Max needed the win, not a P2. Because right now we're coming out of this race. Oscar is, I believe, 63 points ahead of Max now in the constructor standings. So 6 more race weekends to go. Coming into this, Max needed to outscore Oscar by an average of 10 points going into the final race weekends. Of course, he missed that mark this weekend. It's still possible. You never know what's going to happen. But just doesn't seem like it was enough this weekend. And I think he is going to keep putting some pressure on both of the McLarens. But it's just not going to be enough. He's running out of time. And the other thing, too, is this race was very telling as to where this is ultimately going to head in the driver standings with these two teams, McLaren and Red Bull, because this was an important track for Red Bull. They look strong in Baku. They look strong in Monza. Were they going to look strong here? And they did look pretty strong throughout the race weekend. Now, the race on Sunday was a much different story, and we know that in every race weekend. Qualifying can look one way, but race pace and how the race looks on Sunday can be completely different. And Red Bull kind of fell off a little bit. I think if we were at a track where it was easier to overtake, there's a good chance Lando is getting ahead of Max. There's a maybe not as good, but still pretty good chance that Oscar's catching up to Max too and getting around him, especially if he doesn't have a slow pit stop like he dealt with. So, yes, Red Bull's gained some ground. Yes, they looked a lot stronger than they did previous years at this track, and that's a very good sign moving forward. But we are going to some other tracks where the high-speed corners are a lot more critical than what we've seen the last few races, and that's where Red Bull or McLaren's strength is, both with the high-speed corners and their speed through those corners, but also with tire degradation. And we saw a little bit of that today with them as well. But we'll get to some hotter tracks. Mexico City, Austin, Qatar should work a lot more in McLaren's favor. So another hump for Red Bull to get over as far as Max catching up to both of the McLarens in the driver's standing. So he's getting closer. He gained some ground, but I think it's a little bit too late for Max and Red Bull, and they're not going to have enough to finish the job and to really close the gap, especially with where these two McLaren drivers will probably be the rest of the season. Going to Max's teammate, though, before we move on to McLaren and Ferrari, Yuki finishes P12 after qualifying P13. Tough race for him. Had a bad start, lost 4 spots at the start. Again, similar to Max, I think Red Bull went the wrong direction with Yuki and his strategy. Starting him on softs, bringing him in on lap 14 for the hard tires. I think he probably came in a little too early for that pit stop too, and that just put him back. I think he came out of the pits going into, lap 21, 22 when everyone else started coming in. Yuki was all the way back in 19th, so not where he wanted to be. He did get fortunate, though, with a few others ahead of him that were staying out very, very long, hoping for a safety car that allowed Yuki to kind of move his way back up the order. But a lot of this started on Saturday with qualifying. Just a poor qualifying result for Yuki. Not what he needed, qualifying P13, and that just really kind of set him up, especially at this track, for this finish in P12. Not the result that he needed for his future, though. Really coming into this race, especially where he was not last weekend, but last race in Baku, kind of hoping for a top 5 finish for Yuki. And he didn't even crack the top 10. So just the outlook for his future, Red Bull's looking for these top 5 finishes probably, at least top 10 and getting some points in the bag. Not a P12, and not where Yuki needs to be for his future. And I'm starting to wonder too, is there a chance it could be Yuki and Liam both out? We heard some news this week from McLaren that they parted ways with Alex Dunn, the reserve driver. Well, not reserve driver, but a driver in their development program who's had a very strong F2 season. And there's some talks that maybe Racing Bulls, Hadjar gets moved up to Red Bull. Maybe it's Arvid Lindblad and Alex Dunn, both in that Racing Bulls seat for 2026. And Yuki and Liam are both out because Liam, we'll get to him a little later, not really the result he needed either, especially when he's being outperformed by his rookie teammate to, this extent. But sticking with Yuki, tough weekend for him. Hopefully he can bounce back, but things really aren't looking good for his future. Going to McLaren, Lando finishes P3, Oscar finishes P4. We'll start with the team news. They clinched the Constructors' title this weekend with those 2 results. We knew it was going to be a matter of time. And they're, just with how dominant that they've looked all season long, it was going to happen one of these race weekends. But their second Constructors' title in a row, 10th overall for this team. Really good accomplishment for this team, especially looking at where they were in 2022, 2023. I mean, beginning of 2023, they did turn it around that season, but just the bottom of the grid. So very promising to see them turn it around. Of course, they had the Constructors' title last year. They win it again this year. Will it be 3 in a row next year? We'll have to wait and see how the new regulations play out. But a really good turnaround and a really promising turnaround for this team, and promising for the rest of the grid too. That with these new regulations, with how they've adjusted wind tunnel time and the cost cap, that something like this is possible if you get the right people in the building, and they're people who know how to lead a team and know what they're doing and know how to develop a car. And you have two great drivers too, like McLaren has with Lando and Oscar. So great accomplishment for McLaren, and something that will probably make the rest of this season very interesting, because throughout this whole season, we hear about papaya rules. We hear about how it's the team first. We hear about swap positions because it's better for the team and we're protecting your teammate from this driver behind, so we need to do this with strategy. All of that's out the window now because the Constructors is out of the way, and this is just a straight fight for the Drivers' Championship between Lando and Oscar. Maybe Max, but again, I think it's too late for Max. But at least in the ecosystem of the team, it's between Lando and Oscar, and I think we're really going to see them fight, especially after what happened this weekend, because we got another on-track incident between Lando and Oscar. Great start by Lando. That really set it up. He starts in P5, so literally right behind Oscar, who's starting in P3. Gets a good run, goes along the inside of Oscar, makes the move at the beginning, but then bumps into the back of Max's car. That gives him a little bit of understeer. Lando makes contact with Oscar, doesn't send Oscar into the wall, but throws Oscar off a little bit. That allows Lando to get by and get into third place. Now, Lando did come out of it with some broken wing damage, but was still able to carry on. And I was a little impressed by that, because at first when you saw that, you're thinking, the way that this piece of the front wing is flexing around, it's going to fall off at some point, especially with the speeds. I mean, you could see it flexing more and more as Lando's going down the straights. I have no idea how that piece of his front wing hung on for that long, and how he was able to carry on, especially at a track like this, with, just how important aero can be and how much his aero was compromised by the damage to his front wing from that moment. But going to the move itself, Oscar was very unhappy about it. He got on the radio right away, asked if the team was going to do anything about Lando barging into him, were his, exact words. The team gave it a few laps. I think they were waiting to see what the stewards were going to do, because it was, all right, if the stewards are going to say, Lando, you've got a penalty, you're under investigation, or something that looks like, all right, a neutral party thinks Lando did something wrong. I think that was McLaren's way of kind of taking some of the blame off of them, where if it was that situation, they could go to Lando and say, hey, man, we didn't think you did anything wrong, but the stewards say you did, so we got to give the positions back, or you're getting a 5-second penalty, or you do get a 5-second penalty, and we have to deal with that. But stewards disagreed. It was under investigation, or it was noted, but I think it didn't even get to being under investigation, and they decided no further action. And then shortly after that, the team gets on the radio, says, hey, Oscar, we're not going to do anything about it. We felt like it was fair racing. And when the team said that, Oscar, I mean, you hardly ever hear these types of radio messages from Oscar where he actually shows his frustration. Lets out a few cuss words too, which you don't hear too much from him, especially in a heated moment. But Oscar gets on the radio, says, that's not fair. It's not right, and kind of goes on a little bit of a tirade complaining. I thought it was the right move to allow them to race like that and allow them to hold positions. I don't blame Lando for trying that move, and I don't think it was a dirty move. He said it after the race that every single driver would have made that move on the inside if that door was left open, like Oscar left it open for Lando. And again, this is a lap 1 incident, and I think that also played into the stewards' decisions, because lap 1 incidents, stuff like this, like, yes, Lando did make contact with Max. He did make contact with Oscar, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was something that's worthy of a penalty. And I think it was a very bold and honestly a pretty impressive move by Lando to take that risk going along the inside. And this is a championship fight. We want to see them race like this. We want to see these types of moves. And, there was another radio message by Oscar saying, that wasn't very team-like of Lando. Well, guess what, Oscar? Neither was what you did in Monza last year when you went along the inside of Lando. And yeah, there wasn't contact in that situation, but Lando was in the midst of a championship fight with Max at that point, and you were out of it, and you still felt like that was the right move to make. So if this one is not very team-like, that move by you in Monza last year wasn't very team-like. So, I get you take this stuff with a grain of salt with these driver radios during the race because they don't have the benefit. They're just sitting in their cockpit. They don't have the benefit of replay like we do. They don't have the different angles that we can look at. And it is something that Oscar will, of course, review afterwards. And I think he'll probably change his tune a little bit once he sees the replays. And he might disagree a little bit and think, Lando should have kept it under control. But again, it's not something that was worthy of a penalty. It's not something that was worthy of the team telling them to, swap positions back. I thought it was a fair move. And I was honestly glad to see that type of move from Lando in this position in the driver's standings, finally saying, what have I got to lose? Why not take a risk and go along the inside of Oscar and really stick it to him and put myself in a position to compete? Because if he doesn't, all right, let me just stick back and stay in P4. You finish in P4. And that's a 6-point turnaround, from where he finished in P3 to that result in the championship standings. And that can go a long way at this point in the season. So I understand a little bit of Oscar and where he's coming from initially, just his vantage point of everything, but nothing for him to really complain about after the fact, after he has a chance to look at everything. And certainly nothing that warranted steward intervention or team intervention, swapping the positions back. This was a weird weekend for McLaren, though. Came into it thinking, all right, they're probably going to be the favorites for this weekend, but Saturday was just, they weren't anywhere near where we expected them to be in qualifying. Both drivers were struggling. Lando came out and said he just had lost all confidence in the car. Again, Oscar, this isn't his best track historically, so, maybe it was a little bit there too, but they both just seemed very uncomfortable in this car. And, especially with where we saw Lando last year with that win here and how far ahead he was of everybody, didn't expect a Saturday like that from McLaren. Now, it did turn around a little bit on Sunday, and honestly, I thought they looked like the fastest car on track for most of Sunday, but track position was just so important. And once they qualified where they did, and once they were in those positions in P3 and P4 coming out of the first few turns, just wasn't a lot left that they could do, especially without a safety car, causing some type of chaos and shakeup. But moving forward, what does their outlook look like for the rest of the championship? Because we came into this weekend thinking, all right, Red Bull's had a strong weekend in Baku. They had a strong weekend in Monza before that, but those were tracks that were a little more favorable to their car than this one is. So if they look strong here, how strong are they going to look for the rest of the season? Again, I think Red Bull has definitely taken a step forward, and McLaren might have taken a step back, and I don't know if it's just that they stopped their development a little bit too early. Maybe some other teams kept developing, a little later than expected. Of course, we did see Red Bull bring that upgraded floor to Monza a couple races ago, so that one was a little later than expected, when you thought a lot of these teams have kind of closed up shop for this year and have turned towards 2026. So I think that's played into it a little bit too. But again, for Max to really catch up, he obviously has a much better shot at catching Lando, with Lando only being 41 points ahead of him in the driver's standings. But Oscar's 63 ahead, and that's just, it's tough to see him make up that ground, especially with some of the tracks that we're going to head to. Brazil, Qatar, maybe even Austin with the high-speed sections there. Of course, that long straight in Austin is something for McLaren to worry about. But I feel like it's going to be too much, and I feel like McLaren's still a little bit safe, as far as one of their drivers winning the Drivers' Championship. But which one is it going to be? Because Oscar's lead is now down to 22 points. Lando just needs to outscore Oscar by 4 points on average the remaining 6 race weekends. And we've got some sprint races coming in too, which will add some variability too, and just some extra points for them to attain. But Lando's outscored Oscar 3 race weekends in a row now. He definitely has the advantage going and the momentum going, but will it be enough? Can Oscar kind of shake himself out of this slump that he's been in and hold on to the driver's standings? I think this one's going to come down to the final race in Abu Dhabi, and I honestly hope it does, just for entertainment purposes and to keep this season alive and keep it more entertaining. But it's starting to get pretty close. between these two drivers. And there have been some disappointments with Lando lately. Of course, there was the DNF in Zandvoort with the issue with the, I think it was an oil leak that caused that DNF. There was of course, disappointment in Baku last weekend when Oscar does crash out. It's the opportunity Lando needed and was waiting for, and he doesn't really capitalize the way that he needed to. But he's gaining ground on Oscar, and he's chipping away, and he's in that range where if Oscar does get a DNF and Lando wins, that flips it completely, and Lando's back in the lead of the championship. So a lot left to play for between these two McLaren drivers, and I think it's going to get a little tense between the two of them, especially, again, now that the Constructors is out of the way. We don't have to worry about papaya rules anymore. We don't have to worry about putting the team first, but especially after what happened this weekend with that move that Lando put on Oscar. I think that's going to fire Oscar up a little bit. And I think we're probably going to see some moves from both of those drivers like that in the final 6 race weekends where they're really fighting it out for this championship. But for this weekend at least, probably not the weekend they hope for, but a weekend where they come away with the Constructors title and a weekend where they're still in a good position in the Drivers' Championship race. Going to Ferrari, not the best weekend for them. Charles Leclerc finishes P6, Lewis Hamilton finishes P8. Again, with this one, like a lot of drivers this weekend, a lot of it came down to qualifying. Charles qualified P7, Lewis qualified P6. They kind of just, there really wasn't much more that they could have done. They just didn't have the pace to keep up with George, to keep up with even Kimi at the end, to keep up with the two McLarens, to keep up with Max. They kind of just slotted into the 6th and 7th places and kind of just ran their own race. Now, I was worried coming into this race with them, what is the plank wear situation going to look like? Are they going to have to start lifting and coasting? I'd have to go look back at it. I didn't hear any lifting and coasting radio talk between the two Ferrari drivers and the pit wall. We didn't really see their pace drop off significantly because of that issue. So I don't know if it really came into play. So that could be something promising for Ferrari. But at the end of the day, they just didn't have the pace to keep up with the top teams. And we now have 3 teams that were clearly ahead of them this race weekend. Not what they want, especially with the hopes that they came into with this season. Ferrari's not going to win a race this year unless something absolutely insane happens. It's either going to be McLaren, it's going to be Max and Red Bull, it's going to be Mercedes and probably George. Maybe Kimi can win a race, but I think if Mercedes is winning a race, it's probably going to be George. So just not what Ferrari needs. Now, they did have some issues that came up at the end of the race. Both drivers had a brake failure. Lewis's looked a lot worse. Was really just limping to the finish line. I think it happened with 2 or 3 laps to go. At that point, he's 40 seconds ahead of Fernando Alonso. He barely finished ahead of Fernando over the line, but he didn't do it the right way because he went off track way too many times, got the black and white flag, was really just trying to stay ahead of Fernando and do everything that he could. Hoping he wouldn't get that penalty and get noted by the stewards, but he did for track limits and was given a 5-second penalty. So he finished ahead of Fernando, but I think it was like 0.4 seconds. But that 5-second penalty, of course, pushes him back to P8. But again, just an uneventful race for Ferrari, but a disappointing race result with finishing P6 and P8. Just not where this team hoped to be and not what they thought this season would look like. But it's kind of just where they're slotting in. And this is, where they are with the constructor standings, how tight it is between 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Not good news when you have Max and Red Bull winning races. You have George and Mercedes winning races. And Ferrari still hasn't won a race outside of Lewis's sprint win in China. So not a good outlook for the rest of the season. And there's a very good chance they could finish this season P4 in the constructor standings. All right, let's talk some midfield teams. A pretty decent weekend for Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso finishes P7 after qualifying P10. A lot of this one for Fernando came down to the start of the race. He had a great start, gained 2 spots on the opening lap, and then he kind of just slotted into P8 and ran his own race from there. He did have the benefit at the end of the race of Lewis's brake failure that gave him another position, but Really just somewhat of an uneventful race for Fernando. We did get some nice Fernando radio messages that, are always entertaining. But really not a lot he could have done throughout this race to make it any better. He did have that slow pit stop and was able to bounce back from that and make a few overtakes to get back in this position. So really good from Fernando there. But P7 was probably the best that he and this team could have done during this race today. Different story for his teammate Lance Stroll. Finished P13 after qualifying P15. Lance held on really long for a late safety car. Came into the pits on lap 39 for medium tires. I have no idea how he made the soft tires last so long, which are the tires he started the race on. An incredibly long stint during the first half of that race. And it probably would have been a better result if he had a different strategy. But I understand, especially at this track and the safety car rate that we have, just starting on the soft tires, hoping for that safety car. And then you do get to a certain point where it's like, all right, we might as well hold off, see what we can do. And Lance was also in a position where they really just didn't have much to lose. And if that safety car did come, it would have paid off greatly and put them in a much different position in this race. And probably Lance would have come away with some points. So I understand them rolling the dice and, just seeing what they can get with that strategy. But overall for Aston Martin, an important result for them with Fernando getting the points that he did because it's big in the constructor standings. They now have Racing Bulls ahead of them in 6th, Sauber behind them in 8th, but neither of those teams scored any points this weekend. And Aston Martin came away with the 6 from Fernando's result. So we are starting to get some separation in the midfield race, but it looks like it could be really close for 6th and 7th between Racing Bulls and Aston Martin, which now is just a 4-point gap between those two teams. So things are really starting to heat up, and there's a good chance we get some excitement from those two teams in the final 6 races. Speaking of Racing Bulls, pretty sloppy day for them. Isaac Ajar finished P11 after qualifying P8. He did have some contact with Ollie Behrman at the start of the race, which cost him, but then halfway through the race, this one was really the killer. We learned that he was dealing with an engine issue that apparently the team's been dealing with for a while now, but that he was losing 3 to 4 tenths a lap at that point. And you can see that really hurt him the second half of the race and really took him out of contention for a points finish. Despite that, though, we saw some good racing from Ajar and good defending against Fernando. He did get Fernando's Hero of the Day award, which, you always want that. Put that up on your shelf. But still not the Sunday he or the team wanted, especially after qualifying 8th. And again, some of this was out of his control with the engine issue. That incident where he lost some of the front wing. I mean, he probably could have done some things better there, but just another first lap incident and, nothing that you can really put blame on anyone for. But a good, good result, I guess, but just not the result that they wanted, especially with Aston Martin starting to breathe down their necks in the constructor standings. For his teammate Liam Lawson, wasn't really much help from his side of the garage. He finished P16 after qualifying P12. This one really came down to strategy, though. And I think Racing Bulls got a little too greedy, keeping Liam out, hoping for a safety car. And again, you get why teams do this when they have nothing to lose and they have a driver in this situation. But I think there were some points to lose for Liam today by going with that strategy. Right before the pit stops happened, he was running P12, P11, somewhere in that range. There could have been an opportunity for an undercut that got Liam into the points. But to their credit, it could have also ended with Liam finishing just outside of the points. So again, I guess ultimately I understand why they took a big swing, hoping for a safety car, which also, second straight Singapore Grand Prix without a safety car after 14 straight races with one. A little odd there, and I wonder what next year is going to look like and, how all this is going to shake out, but, even more evidence that the odds were in Racing Bull's favor, leaving Liam out, and they just got a bad roll of the dice. So you understand why they made the move. Maybe they could have made it a little better, but not incredibly detrimental for the team. A really impressive bounce back Sunday from Williams. Both cars were disqualified from qualifying for having post-inspection failures after qualifying. So Carlos Sainz ends up starting the race P18. Alex Albon starts from the pit lane. But they nailed it on Sunday. Sainz ends up finishing P10, Albon finishes P14. Only one championship point earned. But for both drivers to make up that much ground in a race like this, at a track where they probably weren't expected to be the strongest, really says a lot about where this team is compared to the others. And it really came down to strategy. Both started on the mediums, but they both stayed out very long on that first stint, hoping for a safety car. Alex Albon came into the pits on lap 43. Carlos came in on lap 52, both for soft tires. But when Alex came out of the pits, he came out in last. Sainz came out of the pits in 15th. And they had that tire advantage being on the soft tires when almost everyone else was on a set of used mediums or hards. But to make up all of those spots and to make all of those overtakes in the final 10, 20 laps at a track like this where overtaking was very difficult, really impressive from Williams and really impressive from both of these drivers. It's also probably a little bit frustrating, though, because I'm sure the team is thinking, all right, if we didn't get disqualified from qualifying, what would these results have looked like? Fortunately for Williams, though, they are sitting pretty comfortably in the constructor standings in 5th place now, 30 points ahead of Racing Bulls. There is still enough time for that gap to disappear, but you have to like Williams' chances of holding on to that spot moving forward. Disappointing weekend for Sauber. Gabriel Bortoleto finishes P17 after qualifying 14th. Nico Hülkenberg finishes P20 after qualifying 11th. Both drivers had some unfortunate incidents that cost them some of their front wing and obviously some pace throughout the race as well. Bortoleto had his at the start of the race running into the back of the Aston Martin, similar to what happened with Lando, but a lot worse than Lando's was because Gabriel had to come into the pits on lap 14 to change it, and by that time, his front wing had completely fallen apart. But that early pit stop really hurt him for the rest of the race, especially at the end, with cars behind him just on much better tires. But he was also stuck behind other cars when he went onto the hard tires earlier in the race, so that slowed him down and cost him a lot of time too. Nico had a pretty sloppy race too. It was a mix of misfortune and bad strategy calls for him. He came in for his first stop on lap 26, and I thought he probably would have been better off coming in a few laps a few laps earlier and going for the undercut. But coming in when he did dropped him to the bottom of the order, and he was kind of just stuck there during the middle part of the race. But then later in the race, he has an incident with Colapinto that breaks off some of his front wing, and then a few laps later, he spins out going into turn 7 trying to make an overtake. And at that point, the team brought him in for a second stop, and he was the only one other than Lewis to make a second stop during this race. But that basically guaranteed that Nico was going to finish P20, or at least at the very bottom of the grid. Disappointing results for Sauber, though, because there was some hope that they could come away with some points this weekend. So to have this result really hurts, especially losing some ground to Aston Martin in the constructor standings. It was a mixed bag for Haas. Ollie Bierman finishes P9 after qualifying P9. Esteban Ocon, on the other hand, finishes P18 after qualifying P17. It was a pretty uneventful race for them. Ocon was dealing with some brake issues, so that was slowing him down a little bit, but there just really wasn't a lot of action on track with either driver, and they both kind of just ran their own race. Looking at the strategy calls that were made, it's probably not much they could have done to make this any better from that aspect either. But the good news is they at least came away with 2 championship points, which brought them a little closer to Sauber in 8th place in the constructor standings. Finishing up with Alpine, another weekend to forget. Franco Colapinto finished P16 after qualifying P16. Pierre Gasly finished P19 after starting from the pit lane. I think some strategy errors played into Colapinto's results. He started on softs and actually gained 3 spots at the start of the race. But looking back, they brought him in way too early on lap 15. And they probably would have been better off extending that first stint. Again, he was on the soft tires, so how far could he extend it is a fair question to ask. But putting him on the hards that early in the race instead of the medium tires they opted for, they should have put him on the hards instead of the medium tires they opted for, because that put Franco at a huge disadvantage at the end of the race. And he was really struggling to hold on and hold position. But at the same time, this car was just slow. And we saw that with Pierre's race. He went with the normal strategy and just wasn't anywhere close to being competitive during this race. Alpine has now only scored points in 4 out of 18 race weekends this season. Not good, and it's hard to imagine them finishing in the points again this season. Alright, that's a wrap on today's episode, recapping the Singapore Grand Prix. We are, of course, off next weekend, but after that, we are back in Austin for the United States Grand Prix at Circuit of the Americas, and I'm excited for that one, because it's a track that a lot of the drivers love, but also one that gives us a lot of excitement. And I'm also very interested to see exactly where Max, Lando, and Oscar end up that weekend and what it means as this championship race heats up a little bit more. I will, of course, be back with a preview episode heading into that weekend, followed by another episode recapping everything we saw in the Grand Prix in qualifying. Thanks to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.